Hey listener, welcome. I'm glad you could join me tonight. I'm your storyteller, and I'll be your companion as you drift off to sleep. Or perhaps as you lie there wide awake, listening to this story, unsure if you'll ever fall asleep again. I'd like to tell you a story about a time when something, well, strange happened at my school. I'm not talking about the usual spooky rumors you hear about old buildings or the occasional haunted house in the area. No, this one was different. It wasn't until years later that I started to realize just how different it really was. My name's Clara. I was 16 back then, a junior at a small high school in a sleepy town. I wouldn't say life was boring, but it was definitely predictable. School, homework, hanging out with friends, the occasional drama between us all. The kind of life you'd expect from any high schooler, really. It wasn't perfect, but it was safe, until one fateful semester when everything changed. It was a typical Tuesday morning when we first met her. Our regular teacher had called in sick, so we got a substitute. That wasn't unusual, happened all the time. But this woman, she was different from any sub we'd had before. She walked into the classroom with a calm, quiet grace. She didn't seem nervous, unlike most substitutes. She seemed perfect, almost too perfect. Her name was Miss Everly. She was tall, with dark hair and sharp, intelligent eyes. She looked like she could have been a teacher at any prestigious school. And yet, she was here in our tiny little high school. At first, I thought it was just me, but after a while, I noticed something was off. She knew exactly what to say to explain every concept. Every student had their question answered immediately and precisely. But that wasn't the weird part. The strange part was the way she seemed to know so much about us. I'll admit, I was a little spooked. One afternoon, while I was packing my bag, I overheard her talking to a student in the back row. She was giving him advice about his family situation, something about his parents not getting along. He looked as confused as I was. "What do you mean? How do you know that?" he asked, clearly shaken. She smiled and simply said, "I just know." That was the first time I felt like there was something off. But I didn't say anything to anyone. Maybe I was just being paranoid, right? Teachers talk to students all the time. Maybe she'd just been picking up on something in passing. But as the days went on, I started to notice more strange things. She never ate, ever. Not during lunch, not even during class breaks. And when you're a high school student, you notice things like that. She was always calm, always collected, never showing a single sign of tiredness. When I asked her once if she wanted to join us for lunch, she just smiled and said, "No, I'm fine. I'll watch you all enjoy yourselves." The other students didn't seem to think much of it. They were too wrapped up in their own world to notice the things I was picking up. But there was another thing. Miss Everly never seemed to sleep. We'd have assignments, and the next day, no matter how late they were due, she would always have them graded. I'm talking about detailed feedback, sometimes with notes that only someone who had been awake for days could write. I started to wonder how she managed all of this, but I kept it to myself. It wasn't until a week or so into the semester that things started to get truly strange. It was a Tuesday again. Funny how so much happened on a Tuesday. And I stayed after school to catch up on some work. The hallways were quiet. The only sound was the hum of the lights above. That's when I saw her, Miss Everly, walking down the hallway by herself. I thought it was strange. She was never in the building after hours. But there she was, standing still in front of the classroom, staring into the window. I walked up to her, not really thinking about it, and said, "Miss Everly, what are you doing here? The day's over." She turned to me slowly, almost too slowly. There was something about her face that I couldn't read. She smiled faintly, but it wasn't a normal smile. It was almost sad. "I'm not done yet," she said cryptically, before turning and walking away without another word. The next few days felt tense, like something was hanging in the air. Everyone in school started to notice the weird things about Miss Everly. She never ate, she never slept, and she always seemed to know what was going on in each of our lives. She'd pull students aside and give them advice about their home lives, or sometimes, she'd mention things about their future, like she could see it happening already. I remember one day, she pulled me aside after class. She looked at me with those strange, knowing eyes and said, "You'll be facing a difficult decision soon. Don't be afraid to trust what's inside you." I didn't understand what she meant, but it stuck with me. It wasn't until a week later that the truth began to slowly unravel. One of my friends, Sarah, found an old newspaper article in the library. It was about a teacher who had died in a car accident years ago, right around the time Miss Everly had started teaching. The article mentioned her name. I didn't want to believe it at first, but then it started to make sense. perfect teacher, the odd behavior, the way she seemed to be stuck. I tried to talk to a few of the other students, but they were just as confused as I was. Some of them even started to have the same suspicions. The atmosphere in class changed. People started feeling uneasy, almost like we were all being watched, even though Miss Everly never seemed to look at us directly. Then one day she wasn't there. We were all in class and she never showed up. The principal came in and told us that Miss Everly had been called away, but no one could get a clear answer on where she went. The substitute she left behind was, well, nothing like her. The atmosphere in the class felt completely different. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I couldn't get to sleep, and every time I closed my eyes, all I could think about was Miss Everly and what we'd learned. It was as though she had been trying to finish something important, before she could finally move on. A few days later, the story took a darker turn. My friend Sarah found something else. A letter hidden in the back of Miss Everly's desk. It was addressed to the school principal, dated years ago, and it spoke about a task that needed completing before she could move on. It didn't go into details, but it was clear that Miss Everly's task had never been finished, and now she was trapped here, teaching us, following us, trying to get us to help her finish it. The school didn't believe us. In fact, when we mentioned anything about Miss Everly, it was as if we were all dismissed as being paranoid. But I could feel it. Even now, years later, there's a part of me that can't forget her. The way she watched us all, the way she knew so much, the way she'd never sleep. I don't know what her task was, but I'm almost certain she never completed it before she moved on. Maybe it's because I never really had the chance to know the truth that I'm still haunted by her presence. Maybe that's why, even now, when I pass by the school or hear someone mention her name, I can't help but feel that shiver down my spine. Sometimes, the scariest part isn't what happened. It's knowing that the things we can't explain might just be real. If you ever find yourself in a situation where something doesn't feel right, don't brush it off. Your instincts might be the only thing that keeps you safe. Believe me, I know that now. Story 2. I've never been one to believe in ghosts or curses. I'm just not built that way. I'm a high school teacher, 28 years old, teaching English in a small suburban town. Nothing too exciting, really. I live in a cozy little apartment with my cat, Momo, who's definitely more of a dog than a cat, if that makes any sense. Life, for the most part, was comfortable, nothing extraordinary. It was just work, some friends, the occasional date, and the normal humdrum of everyday life. That was until I inherited a set of lesson plans from the teacher who had taught at the school before me. Her name was Ms. Lowell, and from what I'd heard, she was pretty well liked by students and staff alike. She'd taught there for over a decade, but no one had seen her for a while. Her sudden disappearance was something everyone kind of brushed off, as things often go in small towns. People speculated that she'd just left, maybe for a new job, or perhaps some family emergency. Nobody really knew. Some even thought she'd taken an extended sabbatical. When I started, they handed me her old lesson plans. No big deal. They were just sitting there in a dusty folder, along with her classroom materials. I thought, hey, why reinvent the wheel? The lesson plans were detailed, structured, and I figured it'd save me a ton of time. That was the first thing that should have raised a red flag, the fact that they were too perfect. Everything was planned out down to the smallest detail, with no room for improvisation. The first few days were normal, maybe even boring. The kids were great, and I stuck to the lesson plans, though I started noticing some weird little things. At first, I thought I was just being paranoid or overworked. I mean, I had just moved into a new town, started a new job, and I was still settling in. But then, the oddities started happening. It started with little things, like the projector turning on by itself after school, even though I was the last one to leave, or the desk chairs moving slightly when I wasn't looking. I thought maybe the building was old, and I was just hearing things, but one day, something happened that I couldn't explain away. I was in the classroom late, grading papers, when I heard a whisper. A faint, raspy voice. I froze. The room was empty. I turned around, scanning the room, and saw nothing. Just the usual desks, the blackboard, the posters on the walls. I even checked the closet. It was empty. At first, I told myself it was nothing, just the wind or my imagination playing tricks on me. But as the days passed, the whispers came more frequently, always when I was alone in the classroom. And they weren't just random whispers either. They were speaking my name, as if someone were right there, just out of sight. One evening, after staying late once again to get ready for the next day's lessons, I decided to investigate further. I made sure to leave the lights on, my phone fully charged, and the door locked. I even considered calling a friend just to keep me company, but that seemed silly, right? It was just a building, a school. The worst-case scenario was maybe a few rats in the walls. But when I turned around to get my coat, I saw something that made my heart stop. On the board, in large, messy handwriting, someone had written, "Don't finish the lessons. It's too late." I froze. My blood ran cold. There was no way it was a prank. The janitor had been the last one in the building before me, and no one had been in the room since then. And yet, the handwriting, it was fresh, as if someone had just scrawled it there in the last hour. I didn't know what to do. My instincts screamed at me to run, but I stayed. I don't know why. Maybe it was the adrenaline, maybe it was just fear, but I stayed. I called the janitor, but he didn't answer. I tried texting a colleague, no response. I walked out of the classroom, feeling like I was being watched. That night, when I got home, I didn't sleep. I kept replaying the words over and over in my head. Don't finish the lessons. The next day, I couldn't shake the feeling of being followed. At school, I felt like eyes were on me, even when no one was around. That same evening, I stayed late again, but this time, I didn't go straight to the classroom. I stopped by the old teacher's desk, the one that had been left untouched since Ms. Lowell's disappearance. I found a small, worn notebook hidden under the drawer. It was her journal. I flipped through it, my heart pounding, until I came across an entry that made my stomach churn. "I'm so close. The lessons are the key. If I finish them, I'll summon him. The force that haunts this school. They've been here for decades, waiting. But if I finish it, it's all over. I'll never leave. I'll be trapped, just like the others." I felt dizzy. I closed the journal and shoved it back in the drawer, not wanting to read another word. But it was too late. The seed had been planted. The whispers grew louder. At night, I would hear the sound of footsteps in the hallways, even when no one was there. One evening, as I was preparing for the next day's lesson, I heard the unmistakable sound of someone dragging their fingers across the chalkboard. When I turned to look, there was nothing there, just empty air. And then there was the vision. It was subtle at first, a fleeting glimpse of a woman's figure in the corner of my eye, standing near the classroom window. But every time I looked, no one was there. Then one day I finally saw her. It was late, and I had stayed behind again to finish grading some papers. I turned to the corner of the room where I kept the bookshelf, and there she was, Ms. Lowell. But her face was pale and gaunt, her eyes wide with a terrifying mixture of fear and anger. She was staring at me, her lips moving, but no sound came from her mouth. The only thing I could hear was the low, droning hum of the lights above. I stumbled back, almost tripping over my own feet. When I looked back, she was gone. The last straw came the next day, when I opened the lesson plan for the final class of the semester. There, in red ink, was a new note. "Complete this, and you'll unleash the darkness. Don't finish the plan, or you'll join us." I wanted to quit, to throw everything away and leave. But something held me there. The next day, as I was about to close the classroom door behind me, I heard it, the unmistakable sound of something scratching at the chalkboard, right behind me. I turned slowly, terrified to face what I knew was waiting for me. Nothing was there, but as I walked closer to the board, I saw it. The words were written in jagged, uneven strokes. "It's too late. You're one of us now." I left that night, and I haven't been back since. They say the school is still there, but I don't know. I don't want to know. Sometimes, I wonder if I'll ever truly escape. Because sometimes, in the quietest moments, I hear those whispers again. And they're always calling my name. Story 3. I remember when I first started teaching at that school. It was a small, quiet place tucked away on the edge of town. A typical high school, nothing out of the ordinary. I was a new teacher, just 24 years old, fresh out of college and eager to start my career. My classroom was at the end of the hallway, a cozy space with wide windows that let in plenty of natural light. It was peaceful. At least, that's how I remember it now. I had no idea what was waiting for me when I stepped into that room. The first few weeks went by like they always do, filled with lesson plans, introductions, and the usual classroom dynamics. The students were fine, nothing out of the ordinary there either. They were respectful for the most part, and the room had that calming, almost comforting vibe that only comes from a place still untouched by the chaos of the world outside. But it all started with the mirror. It was nothing more than a regular classroom mirror, one of those long, rectangular ones mounted to the wall, facing the door. It had been there for years, I later learned. Nothing special about it, but one day, just after I had started explaining the lesson, I glanced up at my reflection, and and something felt off. I couldn't put my finger on it at first. I saw myself standing there, arms crossed, talking to the class. But something was wrong. My reflection didn't match my movements exactly. I paused mid-sentence, watching as my reflection kept talking, but it didn't stop at the same time I did. It was as if it was moving a fraction of a second ahead of me. I thought I was imagining things. Maybe the angle of the mirror or the lighting was playing tricks on me. After all, this was the first time I had ever really noticed it. But that feeling, the one that crawls up your spine when something doesn't quite add up, lingered. I shrugged it off. Nothing to worry about, right? It was probably just the stress of starting a new job, adjusting to the routine. But then it happened again. A few days later, while teaching a different lesson, I caught myself in the mirror once more. This time, my reflection didn't just move differently, it started to change. My smile, which I thought had been warm and welcoming, became twisted, cruel almost. I was smiling at the class, but the reflection showed a version of me that looked darker. It was like I was looking at someone else entirely. I froze mid-sentence, staring at the reflection. The class didn't notice, of course. They were busy with their work, but I couldn't look away from the glass. My reflection, it started to act independently. I saw it shaking its head in disapproval, its mouth moving, but no sound came from it. I was sure that I wasn't doing those things. I wanted to look away, but my feet felt glued to the floor. I fought to regain control, forcing myself to break my gaze and focus back on the students. But the unease never left. The next few days were a blur of confusion and growing dread. I avoided looking directly at the mirror for as long as I could. But eventually, the curiosity got the better of me. I had to know if it was just my mind playing tricks. That's when I noticed something worse. One evening, after everyone had left, I stayed behind to prepare for the next day. The room was quiet, too quiet, and the setting sun cast long shadows across the floor. As I moved around, tidying up, I couldn't help but glance at the mirror. This time, my reflection didn't just act independently. It was showing me things that weren't happening. I watched as my reflection smiled again. But this time, it was more sinister. It looked at me with an almost predatory expression. I saw it turn toward the classroom door, as if watching someone enter. But when I turned to look, no one was there. And then, something that made my blood run cold. My reflection began to move on its own. It turned its head slowly, as if it were a separate entity, watching me from within the glass. It was no longer just a reflection. It was alive. I wanted to scream, but nothing came out. My heart hammered in my chest, and I could feel the sweat beating on my forehead. I had to get out of there, I knew that, but my feet wouldn't move. It was then I noticed something else in the reflection. A figure, a shadow, standing just behind me. I whipped around, but no one was there. The room was empty. When I looked back, the shadow was gone, replaced by the twisted grin of my reflection. I snapped out of my trance and bolted from the room. I couldn't explain what was happening, but I knew I wasn't safe. For days after, I tried to avoid the mirror, but it was always there, in the corner of my eye, a silent observer. I couldn't help but feel like it was waiting for me to make a mistake. The more I tried to ignore it, the more it started to show me things. At first, it was small details, like the reflection of my hand twitching unnaturally, or a flash of something dark crossing the surface. But then it started to show me choices. Dark, unsettling versions of my life. I saw myself making terrible decisions, ones I would never even consider. My reflection would look at me with a knowing, twisted smile. I'd see visions of my life unraveling, disastrous consequences, betrayal, violence. It was like it was trying to tell me something, or worse, become me. I couldn't take it anymore. I sought out the oldest teacher in the school, Mrs. Carter, the one who had been there for decades. She had seen everything. I needed answers. When I explained what was happening, she didn't seem surprised. "Ah," she said softly. "I wondered when it would start." She went on to tell me about the mirror, how it had been there for years, how it had driven others mad before me. She told me it was cursed, trapped with the spirit of a teacher who had once worked there, a teacher who had made dark choices, and whose reflection had never truly been hers. "They say the mirror takes over eventually," Mrs. Carter told me, her voice trembling. "It feeds on your darkest desires. If you don't stop it, it will take over your life completely." I was terrified. What was I supposed to do? Mrs. Carter handed me a small, old book. It was filled with ancient rituals, ways to banish spirits, break curses. But she warned me that it would be dangerous. And time was running out. I took the book and went straight to the classroom. The mirror was there, waiting, watching. It felt almost alive. I performed the ritual. Every word felt like it took every ounce of energy I had left. The reflection was chaotic, twisting in ways that made my stomach churn. But as I finished, I felt the weight lift from my shoulders. The room went still. For a moment, I thought it was over. But then the reflection moved again. It looked at me, smiled, and then, just for a split second, it was me. I can't explain it, but something inside me snapped. I knew I had to destroy it. I smashed the mirror with all the strength I could muster, the sound of shattering glass echoing through the empty classroom. It was done, but I haven't felt safe since. Every time I look in a mirror, I feel that cold, empty stare from behind my reflection. And sometimes, when I least expect it, I swear I see it smile. It's been weeks since that day, but I can't forget the feeling of being watched. It's always there, lurking. If you ever find yourself in a classroom, a hallway, a place where you can't escape your reflection, be careful. Because sometimes the mirror doesn't just show you who you are. It shows you who you could be. And that's the part you might never come back from. Sometimes the scariest part isn't what happens. It's knowing it could happen again. Story 4. It was supposed to be just another year of teaching. The same routine, the same kids, the same paperwork. I had been teaching high school English for nearly 5 years by the time I was assigned to room 204. It was the kind of room that no one really talked about. You know, the one tucked away at the far end of the building, next to the janitor's closet, where the paint was always chipped and the lighting was never quite right. The kind of room that seemed forgotten by everyone but the students who got stuck there. I didn't think much of it at first. I was excited about the new semester, new students, new curriculum, new opportunities to inspire. But the first day I stepped into room 204, I had this strange feeling. Something about the place just didn't sit right with me. The walls were lined with old, peeling wallpaper that looked like it had been there for decades. There were strange symbols etched into the wood on the desks, like someone had scratched them into the surface with a knife. I chalked it up to some overzealous student from years ago. It didn't bother me too much, but it was definitely unsettling. When I met the students, I tried to push aside the feeling of unease. They were excited, but also a little nervous, as most high schoolers are at the start of the year. I started my lesson, trying to establish a sense of normalcy. Everything seemed fine at first. We settled into our routine, with me teaching, the students listening, everything the way it always is. But then things started happening. At first, it was small things that I thought I was just imagining. I'd come into the classroom after lunch, only to find the chairs moved out of place. I'd be in the middle of a lesson, and I'd hear a soft tapping, like someone knocking at the door. But when I checked, there was no one there. I told myself it was nothing. I was just tired. I had a lot on my plate. It was the beginning of the year, after all, and I was still getting settled. But then it started happening more often. And it wasn't just the furniture or the sounds. There was something about the air in that room. It was always colder than the rest of the school, no matter what time of year it was. I would sometimes feel a shiver run down my spine when I was teaching, as if someone was watching me from the shadows. It was never obvious, but it was there, just enough to make my heart race. One afternoon, after the students had left for the day, I decided to stay late and work on some lesson plans. The school was quiet, and the only sound was the hum of the lights above. That's when I saw it. I had been sitting at my desk, working, when I glanced up at the blackboard. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, but when I looked closer, I could see it, scratches. They weren't there when I started, and yet, now they were etched into the surface of the board, long, deep marks, like something had tried to claw its way out. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. Who had done that? And why? I stood up quickly, but as I did, I heard it, a low, guttural sound like a moan, coming from somewhere in the back of the room. I didn't think. I grabbed my things and bolted out of the room, locking the door behind me. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling of dread. I kept imagining what could be happening in that room when I wasn't there. Who, or what, was trying to make its presence known. The next morning, I was back in the classroom, determined to carry on as usual. I tried to put it out of my mind, but when I walked in, I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The room was colder than before, and the same marks were on the blackboard again. But this time, there was something new. Written below the scratches in a scrawled, uneven hand were words, "Get out." I froze. My breath caught in my throat. I looked around the room, but there was no one else there. The class hadn't started yet, and I was alone. My mind raced. Could someone have broken in during the night? But how would they have known what I'd seen? It didn't make sense. I tried to stay calm, but it was hard. The students trickled in one by one, and I tried to teach like nothing was wrong. But I could barely focus. I kept hearing strange noises, footsteps behind me, whispers in the corners of the room. But when I turned, no one was there. It only got worse after that. I started noticing more strange markings, symbols carved into the walls, almost like they were deliberate, like they had been there for a long time. And every time I left the room, I felt a growing sense of dread, as if something was watching me, waiting for me to slip up. Then one night, after class, I decided to do something I should have done weeks ago. I went to the library to do some research on the history of the classroom. I knew the school was old, but I had never really wondered about the building's past. That night, I found something that made my blood run cold. There were rumors I discovered about room 204. Old rumors long forgotten by most. Apparently, decades ago, the room had been used for something dark. There were whispers of rituals, dark rituals, the kind you only hear about in ghost stories. According to the records, a group of students had disappeared in the 1940s, all of them from room 204. Some said they had left on their own, but others believed they had been taken, claimed by whatever dark force lurked there. The more I read, the more the hairs on my neck stood up. According to the story, the spirits of those lost students still haunted the room, bound to it by the rituals that had been performed. They were trapped, angry, and they sought to claim anyone who stepped foot in that room, to add them to their collection. I couldn't believe it. This was insane, right? But as I stood there in the quiet of the library, the words echoed in my mind. They seek a new victim. I couldn't ignore it anymore. There was something in that room, something old, something powerful, and it wanted me. That night, I went home, but I didn't sleep. I sat up, my mind racing. Every sound, every flicker of light, sent me into a panic. I couldn't stop thinking about what I had learned, about the spirits that were waiting for me. The more I thought about it, the more I realized how close I was to losing myself, to becoming one of them. I had to leave, but no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't escape. Every time I entered that room, the feeling of dread would return. The strange markings on the walls grew, the whispers louder. I tried to reach out to the school administration, but they brushed me off. "It's just an old room," they said. "You're overthinking it." But I knew that something wasn't right. In the weeks that followed, I could feel it tightening around me. The spirits were getting closer, and one night, I walked into room 204 to find the markings on the wall had changed. The words were no longer "get out." Now they said, "It's too late." The last thing I remember before I left was hearing those same low, guttural moans. And then, everything went black. I don't teach at that school anymore. I couldn't. I moved away, far away, but even now, I can still hear those whispers, just on the edge of my hearing. Sometimes when I close my eyes, I see those symbols on the wall, see those students' faces in my dreams staring back at me. And every now and then, I swear I hear them call my name, as if they're still waiting, still hungry, still looking for their next victim. Sometimes, the scariest part isn't what happened. It's knowing it could happen again. So, if you ever find yourself in an old, abandoned classroom, maybe think twice before you sit down. You might be the next one they're waiting for. Story 5. You probably think teaching is a safe, boring job. You hear high school English teacher and picture piles of essays, coffee breath, and early nights. But I'm telling you, I'll never look at a classroom the same way again. My name's Rachel. I was 29 at the time this happened, and I'd just moved to a small town in Oregon for my first long-term teaching position. I'd been subbing and hopping from district to district for years. This new school, Crescent Hill High, offered stability, benefits, and I thought peace. I moved into a modest one-bedroom apartment, just a 15-minute drive from campus. Quiet neighborhood, big trees, neighbors who smiled but didn't pry. It felt like a clean slate. Teaching 11th grade English sounded straightforward. I had lesson plans, a decent classroom with windows, and a pretty chill batch of students. For the first couple weeks, things were just normal. I was grading essays, drinking way too much coffee, and slowly learning who was trouble and who was quiet. But around the third week, I noticed something. There was this kid, always in the last row, furthest seat by the window. Never raised his hand, never caused problems, but he was just there, always still, always staring forward. Not at me, not at the board, just forward. I didn't even know his name at first. Roll call always moved fast, and I didn't really double-check who answered unless someone was missing. But then I started paying more attention. I realized I never got any homework from him. No participation, no questions, But every day there he was, same seat. Pale skin, longish black hair that almost covered his eyes. Hoodie even when it was warm. I thought maybe he was shy, or struggling silently. So one afternoon during grading time, I asked the class if anyone had seen Nathan Reynolds. That was the name listed next to the seat. Silence. I tried again. Nathan, are you here? No answer. I looked to the back of the room, and he was sitting there, not reacting, just staring. I felt a little embarrassed, honestly, like maybe he was being shy and I just called him out in front of everyone. But when the bell rang, he didn't move. Students filed out around him, some chatting, some rushing for lunch, and he just stayed, staring. I stood by my desk, trying to look casual. Hey Nathan? I called, gentle but firm. He didn't blink. I walked a few steps toward him. You doing okay? You haven't turned anything in. Do you need help catching up? Still nothing. I got a little closer, only a couple feet away, and just as I opened my mouth to speak again, he vanished. Not like he got up and left. I mean, 1 second, he was there, and the next, that seat was empty. I blinked, walked right up to the row, looked around, confused. I even checked the hallway, thinking maybe he slipped past while I looked away. But there's only one door. I would have heard it. I stood in that doorway for a while, watching the students scatter across the quad, trying to calm the weird flutter in my chest. I told myself it was just stress, or maybe I thought I saw someone. Maybe my mind filled in the seat because I'd gotten used to seeing it occupied. It didn't help that when I checked the attendance system later that day, there was no Nathan Reynolds enrolled in any of my classes. Not just missing, not absent, just not there. I asked the front office the next day if there was a mistake with the roster. They told me it was all synced from the district system and shouldn't be wrong. I even checked with another teacher, Mr. Gutierrez, who'd been there a while. Nathan Reynolds, he repeated. Doesn't ring a bell. I've had juniors for 6 years. Never had a Nathan with that last name. That should have been the end of it, right? But the next week, he came back. Same seat, same clothes, same blank stare. I stopped calling on him. I stopped acknowledging him at all, to be honest. I figured, I don't know, maybe I was cracking. Burnout, hallucinations, something. But one Friday afternoon, something shifted. Class had ended, students were leaving, and I was erasing the board when I heard footsteps behind me. Not the usual shuffling and chatter. Just one slow step after another, getting closer. I turned around quickly. It was him, standing halfway down the aisle now. Closer than he'd ever been. Still silent. But something about his eyes this time, they looked worried. Like he wanted to say something but couldn't. My stomach turned. I didn't say anything. I couldn't. Then he raised one hand. Just slightly. Like a motion for me to wait. Or listen. And then he mouthed something. 3 words. I didn't hear a sound. But I saw his lips move. Deliberate. Slow. Find the locker. I stood frozen. Heart pounding. He turned and walked toward the door. Except he didn't walk out. He passed through the door. Through the wood. Gone. That night, I didn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, going over what I saw. What he said. I wasn't dreaming. I wasn't hallucinating. I saw him. He spoke. So Monday morning, I got to school an hour early. I went to the admin office, pretending I'd lost a personal item and wanted to check the lockers for it. They handed me the master key, didn't ask too many questions. I started with the lockers near my classroom. Row by row, cold metal doors. Some were empty. Some had textbooks, old hoodies, random trash. And then, I got to locker 310. It smelled faintly of mildew. Inside, there was only one item. A notebook. Worn. Water damaged. The kind students use for math or doodling or journaling. I opened it. The first page had a name scrawled in blocky handwriting. Nathan Reynolds. I flipped through the rest. Most pages were blank or smeared, but there were maybe a dozen entries still legible. They weren't essays or class notes. They were please. Notes like, I told them I didn't want to go. He said we had to keep it secret. The room under the gym isn't locked. They think no one knows. If someone finds this, look in the boiler room. My skin prickled. There was a storage area beneath the gym. I remembered a coach mentioning it once. Old maintenance space, not used anymore. I didn't tell anyone what I found. Not yet. That afternoon, after the last bell, I slipped away and headed to the gym. The janitor's closet at the back had an old, rusted staircase. I used my phone flashlight. Every creak echoed through the metal like a scream. The basement was dark and damp. Dust in the air. Smelled like mold and rusted pipes. At the far wall, past broken chairs and stacked mats, was a small boiler room door. No lock. I pushed it open. There, tucked in the corner behind the tank, was a backpack. Faded, torn, and next to it, a pile of clothes, hoodie, jeans, decayed beyond recognition. I backed away, mouth dry, and then I saw the wall. Scratched into the plaster, again and again, were the same 3 words. He hurt me. I reported it anonymously. Told them I was exploring the basement and found something strange. The police got involved. They called it remains of interest. Took months, but eventually they confirmed through DNA. The bones belonged to Nathan Reynolds. He'd been reported missing 5 years earlier. Last seen leaving school late after detention. Case went cold. The school claimed they had no record of him ever being at Crescent Hill. Said he must have transferred in briefly, paperwork lost in the shuffle. I don't believe that. And here's the part that still keeps me up at night. The man who used to teach my class, the one I replaced, Mr. Dawes, he disappeared the same semester Nathan was last seen. Just quit mid-year. No forwarding address. No explanation. They said he left for personal reasons. I don't think he left. I think he was the reason. I think Nathan's spirit lingered, trying to tell someone the truth. And I was the only one who finally listened. After all this, I transferred schools the next year. I couldn't walk into that classroom without checking the back row. But sometimes late at night, when I close my eyes, I see him again. Still, watching, waiting, like he's not done, like he's still making sure I remember what he said. So if you ever work at a school, if you ever notice a student who's always there, always silent, never turning in work, pay attention. Because sometimes the students who seem invisible are the ones screaming the loudest, and sometimes they're not alive at all. Story 6. I never thought my life would take such a dark turn, not at a place like this. I was a teacher at an elite private school, one of the top in the city, surrounded by the kind of wealth and prestige you only see in the movies. Everything seemed perfect, almost too perfect. But sometimes, perfection is just a mask for something much darker beneath. I'm Sarah Whitaker, a 34-year-old history teacher, freshly hired at Westbrook Academy. My life before this job was ordinary. I lived in a quiet apartment in the suburbs, worked long hours, and never gave much thought to anything beyond my routine. I was content, or at least I thought I was. The first day I stepped into the classroom at Westbrook, I knew things would be different. The school was massive, almost intimidating. The marble hallways echoed with the sound of polished shoes, and the students, well, they looked like something out of a movie. They were all impeccably dressed, with that effortless grace that comes from privilege. I had been hired to teach advanced history, but it was clear that I was the one who had to prove I belonged. But none of that mattered when I met Caleb. Caleb Sullivan was a senior in my class. He was quiet, reserved, almost too quiet. He had this strange air about him, like he was always somewhere else. And the way he looked at me with those piercing blue eyes made me feel uneasy. But I told myself I was just being paranoid. After all, I was new. Maybe I was just overthinking things. But then something happened that made me realize my instincts weren't as off as I thought. It started subtly, small things that I shrugged off at first. Caleb would sometimes look at me with a knowing smile, like he could see right through me. It was unsettling. At first, I thought maybe he just had a thing for older women. But as the days went on, it became clear that it was something more. His predictions, his observations, every time I'd ask him a question about the class, he'd give me the answer before I even finished asking. Caleb, I asked one day, how do you think the French Revolution influenced the political structure of modern Europe? Before I could even finish, he replied, well, it didn't just influence Europe. It set a precedent for revolutions all over the world, especially the Latin American ones. I froze. That was exactly what I was going to say. But it didn't stop there. Caleb started making more predictions. He predicted the weather one afternoon, telling me it would rain in the evening, which it did. He even predicted the exact time the fire drill would go off the next week. I laughed it off as coincidence at first, but it kept happening. The more I saw Caleb, the more it felt like he was slipping into my mind. It was like he knew things I hadn't even said aloud. His eyes would linger on me longer than anyone else's, and sometimes, I swear, I'd catch him staring at me with an almost predatory intensity. One afternoon, after class had ended, I decided to confront him. It felt strange, too strange, but something inside me told me I had to. Caleb, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. How do you know these things? He looked at me with that same eerie calmness, his eyes narrowing slightly. "I've always known," he said softly, almost as if speaking to himself. "It's a gift." I didn't know how to respond. It wasn't just the answers to my questions, it was everything. The way he spoke, the way he seemed to predict my every move. I wanted to laugh it off, tell myself he was just some oddball student who had a knack for guessing, but something in his words lingered. A gift. He nodded, his expression growing more serious. "It's not something I asked for, but it's something I've learned to live with. And I can tell you, Ms. Whitaker, it's not always a blessing." I tried to laugh it off, but his words kept echoing in my mind long after I left his presence. It was only later, much later, when I realized that Caleb's gift was something far darker than I ever imagined. One evening, as I sat at home grading papers, I got a message from Caleb. It was late, way too late, and the message simply read, "You should go to sleep now, Ms. Whitaker. Your health isn't what it used to be." I felt a chill crawl up my spine. How did he know I hadn't been feeling well? I hadn't told anyone, not even my family. I hadn't mentioned the strange fatigue that had started creeping into my bones, or the way my skin seemed to be aging at an alarming rate. But Caleb knew. The next day, Caleb didn't come to class. His absence went unnoticed by everyone except me. I spent the whole day wondering where he was, trying to shake off the gnawing sense of dread that had settled in my chest. When Caleb finally returned to class the following day, he looked different. It was subtle, but there was something off about him. He looked healthier, almost glowing. His skin was clearer, and his eyes had a sharpness that hadn't been there before. It wasn't until I got home that night that I began to truly understand what was happening. I found a note in my mailbox. No return address, no name, just a simple message written in black ink. "You should never have gotten too close. The price is being paid." I felt a wave of dizziness wash over me as I read the words. The next morning, I woke up to a horrifying realization. My reflection in the mirror didn't look like me anymore. My hair was graying, my face lined with wrinkles that hadn't been there the night before. I looked older, much older, while Caleb, the student who had barely looked 17, now appeared younger than ever. It was as if we had switched places. The truth hit me like a ton of bricks. Caleb wasn't just predicting the future, he was draining my life force. His gift wasn't some harmless quirk, it was the result of a dark bargain made years ago, one that had tied his life to mine in a twisted, parasitic way. As I grew older, Caleb seemed to grow younger. He was feeding off me, stealing my energy, my time, my youth, until nothing was left of the woman I once was. I couldn't stop it. I couldn't even fight back. One night, after a particularly grueling day of teaching, I tried to confront him. I waited for him in my classroom, hoping that I could get some answers. But when he arrived, he was different. Colder, more detached. "You should have never come looking for answers," Caleb said, his voice eerily calm. "The bargain was made. There's no going back now." I tried to scream, to run, but my legs were weak. My vision blurred as I stumbled toward the door, feeling like I was being dragged into the abyss. My reflection in the glass was no longer my own. It was the face of a woman much older than me, trapped, powerless. I don't remember much after that. I woke up in the hospital a few days later, my body weak, my mind foggy. Caleb was gone, but I know he hasn't left. He's always there, lurking in the corners of my mind, watching me, waiting for the next time I slip up. I'm different now, changed. My youth is gone, and it feels like I'm aging faster every day. I don't know how much longer I can keep fighting this, but I have to try. So here's my warning. If you meet someone like Caleb, someone who can predict the future, someone who knows things they shouldn't, don't get too close. Because sometimes the gift isn't what it seems. Sometimes the price is more than you can pay. And sometimes the scariest part isn't what happens, it's what's already happened to you. Sometimes the scariest part isn't what happens, it's knowing it could happen again. Story 7. I'm a teacher, and I've worked at the same school for over 6 years. It's an average high school in a quiet suburban neighborhood, the kind of place where you can hear the rustling of leaves in the trees during autumn and the hum of passing cars on the streets. I'm not married, don't have any kids, and my life has been mostly routine. School in the morning, grading papers at night, the occasional weekend outing with friends, but nothing that would make you sit up in your seat and think, wow, her life's interesting. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful, but that all changed last year. It started with an assignment, a new project I introduced to the class, something to challenge their creativity. The students were to research an important historical figure, create a presentation, and write an essay about their impact on history. Simple enough, right? I mean, we've all done something like it. It should have been nothing more than a minor blip in my day-to-day, but there was something off about the whole thing. Something I didn't realize until it was too late. One of the students, Jared, a quiet kid who had never stood out in my class, was the first to catch my attention. He was always a bit of an oddball, but harmless. I didn't think much of it when he failed to turn in the project on time. Kids forget things, it happens. What really struck me as strange was how he began to act once the assignment deadline passed. At first, it was just small things, things that could easily be brushed aside. He started showing up late to class, eyes bloodshot, looking like he hadn't slept in days. I thought maybe he was just stressed, struggling with his other classes, or dealing with something personal at home. But then it escalated. Jared became erratic. His behavior turned more violent. His responses in class were sharper, more aggressive. He would argue with other students over the smallest things, his fists clenched as if he were ready to throw a punch at the slightest provocation. One day, he even slammed his desk so hard it shook the entire classroom. The look in his eyes, it wasn't like Jared anymore. It was as if something had taken over. But what really freaked me out happened during a regular class session, when Jared was writing something on the board. He looked back at me for a split second, and for the briefest of moments, his eyes weren't human. It was like something dark was staring through him. I shook it off, thinking I was just imagining things, exhaustion from work and stress, right? I couldn't be sure. The next day, Jared wasn't at school. I assumed he was just sick or had something come up. It wasn't until a few days later that I noticed the other students starting to act strange too. One by one, students who had turned in their projects on time began exhibiting signs of the same kind of aggression. It wasn't just Jared anymore. There was something off about them. Their behavior was wild, erratic, like something had taken control of their minds. At first, it was subtle. Emily, who was normally a quiet, well-behaved girl, became uncharacteristically snappy. She would turn red in the face over the smallest criticism, and she punched a locker in frustration one morning, nearly breaking her hand. James, the star athlete, usually calm and collected, got into a fistfight with a kid from the other class over something trivial. Then it happened to Tom, a perfectly normal kid, always polite, who suddenly started hurling insults at me in front of the class. "You're nothing. You don't even know what you're talking about," he shouted, his hands shaking in fury. And this wasn't the worst part. As the days went on, the incidents kept piling up. I couldn't ignore it anymore. Students were turning on each other, their anger spiraling out of control. And the strangest part was that they all had one thing in common. They'd all done the assignment. Every single one of them. I began to piece things together and realized that whatever was happening to them had to be connected to that project. There was something dark about it, something I couldn't explain. One evening after class, I stayed behind, alone in the school library, digging into the school's history. My heart raced with the realization that there was something more to this. Something buried deep within the walls of this place. That's when I found it. In the oldest records of the school, dating back to its founding in the late 1800s, I came across a series of bizarre documents. Notes about a curse tied to an ancient evil that had been sealed within the school. The first headmaster had allegedly been involved in dark rituals, using the school as a cover to practice occult ceremonies. The project I had assigned wasn't just any assignment. It had been a method of summoning this evil, using the creative energy of the students to fuel its return. I was horrified. The evil had never truly left. It had just been dormant, waiting for the right moment to rise again. And now, with each student completing the assignment, they were feeding it, giving it power. Jared and the others weren't acting out of their own free will. They were being consumed by something ancient, something that had been buried for generations, only to be awakened by my simple project. The night I found this out, I rushed to the school to try to stop the curse, to reverse whatever had been set in motion. It was too late. The students had already begun to turn. Jared was waiting for me in the hallway, his eyes black as coal, his face twisted into something unrecognizable. "You should have never given them the assignment," he said in a voice that wasn't his, the words heavy with malice. "You'll regret it." I tried to run, but I couldn't. The air was thick, suffocating, like the walls themselves were alive, closing in around me. The lights flickered, and the sound of whispers filled the hall. I could feel the presence of something behind me, something that wanted me to join them, to become another vessel for its evil. But I didn't. I fought it, and in the end, I barely managed to escape. I don't know how I made it out that night. I don't know if the curse was broken or if it's still out there, waiting for someone else to pick up where I left off. But here's the thing, sometimes the scariest part isn't what happened. It's knowing it could happen again. The school's been quiet since then. They say Jared's family moved away, that he's gone now. But I know better. There are rumors of strange things still happening around the school, of students getting lost in the halls, disappearing into thin air. I don't know if it's the curse still holding on, or if something darker is lurking. But if you ever find yourself at a school, any school, be careful what assignments you give. You never know what ancient evil might be waiting for the right project to bring it back. Story 8. It's funny how life can seem so ordinary until something small happens. Something that at first you brush off. Something that you think can't possibly mean anything. But over time it becomes harder to ignore until it grows, filling every moment of your life, gnawing at your sanity. That's exactly how it all started for me. I'm Emma, and this story begins in a small, sleepy town on the outskirts of town. Nothing special, really. I was 27 at the time, and had just started my first full-time teaching job at the local high school. The position was for English, a subject I loved, and I thought my days would be spent in quiet classrooms, helping kids write papers and discuss books. Simple, right? In the beginning, that's exactly how it was. The weather was typical for that time of year. Chilly mornings, crisp air, the kind that makes you want to wrap yourself in a scarf and gloves. The school was old, creaky, with high ceilings and long hallways that echoed with every step. It was one of those places that smelled faintly of old paper and wood polish, nothing unusual. I was just settling in, getting to know the students, and adjusting to my new routine. But something about my new job didn't sit right from the start. I remember one afternoon, I was looking for a document in the staff room when I overheard some of the other teachers talking about the previous instructor I was replacing. Their conversation stopped the moment they saw me. "Oh, you must be the new teacher." Mrs. Holt, the head of the English department, said, her smile a little too tight. "Yes," I replied, feeling a little confused. "I'm Emma. I'm replacing Mr. Thompson." There was an uncomfortable pause. "Mr. Thompson?" she echoed, clearly not knowing who I was talking about. "You mean you're filling in for him?" "Yes. He was here last year." Another teacher, Mr. Roberts, looked at Mrs. Holt, then back at me. "You sure about that? There's no record of a Mr. Thompson being here in years." I was taken aback. "But I saw his file when I applied. He was teaching here last year." Both teachers exchanged an odd glance, but then shrugged it off with a forced smile. "Ah, well," Mrs. Holt said, waving her hand. "It's probably nothing. Anyway, welcome aboard." I chalked it up to some office mix-up. But the nagging feeling in the back of my mind wouldn't let me forget it. The more I thought about it, the stranger it seemed. I mean, how could the school just forget a teacher who was supposedly there only a year ago? And why did no one seem to know anything about him? That night, I decided to do some digging. The next day, I found the school's old yearbooks in the library. I went through them carefully, flipping through pages filled with pictures of the faculty. There it was, a photo of Mr. Thompson, but it was old, dated back decades ago, at least 15 years. This wasn't the same man I'd seen in the staff file. I felt a chill run down my spine. It was as if the man who had supposedly been teaching in that classroom hadn't existed at all. My curiosity got the better of me. I asked around, anyone who might have known something. The older teachers I spoke to only shrugged, saying they hadn't seen Mr. Thompson in years. But no one ever gave me a clear answer. The strangest thing of all, though, was how the students acted around his old classroom. It was almost as if they were too afraid to even talk about it. A few kids muttered something about old stories when I asked, but they quickly shut down. When I pressed one of them, a boy named Mark, he just looked at me with wide, nervous eyes. "Please, just don't ask about him, Ms. Anderson," he said, his voice low, almost pleading. "It's better if you don't." I didn't know what to make of it. I felt more unsettled than ever, but I couldn't just drop it. Something about this was bigger than I realized. One afternoon after class, I decided to stay late and look around Mr. Thompson's classroom. It was dark, except for the dim light from the hallway filtering through the cracked door. The room was freezing, and I could swear I felt a cold draft despite the windows being closed. I shivered, pulling my cardigan tighter, and made my way to the old desk at the front of the room. That's when I noticed something strange, something that made my heart race. On the chalkboard was a message, written in a hurried, almost frantic hand. "I need to finish it. Please help." My pulse quickened. It wasn't from the previous lesson. It wasn't anyone from the class I'd just taught. It was fresh, as if someone had written it recently. I turned around, half expecting to find someone standing in the doorway, but the room was empty. I rushed out, my mind racing. I could feel my breathing getting shallow, and my hands were clammy. Was someone playing a prank on me? Was I going crazy? The next day I dug deeper. I stayed up late, scouring old records, looking for anything that could explain what was happening. It was then that I found it, a news article from years ago about a teacher who had died in that same classroom under mysterious circumstances. The article was vague, but it mentioned something about a tragic accident and how no one had ever really understood what had happened. The teacher's name wasn't Mr. Thompson. It was another name entirely, a name that didn't seem to match the photo I'd seen. But the similarities were undeniable, the same age, the same classroom. I couldn't breathe. It was like I had stumbled upon something I wasn't meant to uncover. The pieces were falling into place now. The previous teacher hadn't just been absent, he'd died. And now, he was somehow haunting the classroom. I decided to confront one of the older teachers again, someone who had been here longer than anyone else. Mrs. Sinclair. She'd taught here for over 30 years and was known for knowing every secret in the building. I asked her about Mr. Thompson, hoping she'd give me some answers. She paused, and for the first time, she looked genuinely afraid. "You shouldn't be asking about him," she said, her voice trembling. "He's still here. He never left." I felt the blood drain from my face. "What do you mean?" "The last teacher who taught in that classroom," she continued, her voice barely above a whisper, "he died there. His ghost is still trapped in the room, and he's been trying to possess anyone who comes in next, trying to finish what he started." Her words didn't sink in right away. I could hardly believe it, but the fear in her eyes told me she wasn't lying. And suddenly, everything started to make sense. The strange occurrences, the students' fear, the chill in the air. But the worst part, it wasn't over. The next day, as I was teaching, I felt a strange presence beside me. A coldness, almost like someone was standing just out of sight. I turned, but no one was there. The feeling lingered, oppressive, suffocating. Then it hit me, he was trying to take me. I couldn't ignore it anymore. I had to leave. I tried to pack up my things, but my body felt heavy, as if something was pulling me back, trying to keep me in that room. I struggled to move, panic rising in my chest. "Please," I whispered to myself. "This can't be happening." But it was. The ghost was real, and it wanted me to finish whatever it had started. I've never returned to that classroom. Months have passed since then, but I still feel his presence sometimes. A cold wind on the back of my neck, a shadow just out of the corner of my eye. It's as if he's always watching, waiting for me to go back and finish what he couldn't. Sometimes the scariest part isn't what happened. It's knowing it could happen again. If you ever find yourself in a room that feels too cold, with a chalkboard covered in messages that don't belong, trust me, turn around and walk away. Don't ask questions, because you may just end up becoming part of the story. And in this case, it's one that doesn't have an ending. Story 9. This happened to me a few years ago. I was a teacher in a small town, teaching high school English. You know the type of place I mean, the kind where everyone knows everyone, where the biggest event of the week is the local Friday night football game, and where nothing really changes. At least, that's how it felt before things started. Well, unraveling. My name's Claire. I'm 30 now, but I was 26 at the time. Just starting out in my teaching career, excited to make a difference, all that typical stuff. The school itself was old, really old. You could tell it had been around for decades, maybe longer. The walls creaked, the floors squeaked, and there was always this musty smell in the hallways, no matter how much the janitors tried to mask it. It was just a regular day when everything started. I had my first-year students, a class of freshmen, ready to dive into Shakespeare. And honestly, it felt like any other day at first. I'm sure you've been there, right? When everything seems like it's going according to plan, but you can't shake the feeling that something's a little off. That day was the first time I noticed something strange. It started with Emily, a shy girl who always sat at the back of the class. She was the quiet type, always doodling in her notebook, hardly ever speaking. I'd noticed her before, but that day something about her caught my attention. She kept looking at me in this odd way, like she was reading me. And I'm not talking about a glance here or there. No, this was something different. Every time I looked over at her, her eyes were locked on mine, intense and focused. I shrugged it off at first. Maybe it was just my imagination. Teachers don't get much downtime, right? But then it started to happen with other students too. One by one, they'd glance up at me like they knew exactly what I was thinking, like they could hear my thoughts. I couldn't understand it. It was like they were all connected. The thing is, it wasn't just the students who seemed off. As the days went by, I started hearing things in my head. Little snippets of thoughts that didn't belong to me. At first, it was harmless, just passing thoughts like a song lyric or a random word. But then, the thoughts started getting more detailed, more specific. I would walk into class, and I could feel what each student was thinking. And I knew exactly what they were thinking. I could hear their doubts about their homework, their fear of failing, even their petty complaints about one another. It was like a flood of thoughts, all rushing in at once. But it wasn't just the usual teenage angst. No, something darker started to emerge. I don't know why I didn't question it at first. It seemed normal. I guess when something is happening to you, and it's new, you tend to just accept it without thinking too hard. But then one day it happened. I walked into the classroom, and I heard something dark. I'm not talking about a fleeting thought. No, this was a memory, a deep, personal memory. It was about one of my students, Jared. He was this athletic kid, always chatting with his friends, never really paying attention in class. But in that moment, I could hear his thoughts, and I could see his past. I saw a memory clear as day. He was standing in a dark alley, his hands trembling, holding something in his palms. It was a knife. I froze. The memory wasn't mine. It was his. And that's when it hit me. This wasn't just some coincidence. I wasn't hearing random thoughts anymore. I was hearing everyone's thoughts. But even more chilling, I was seeing their memories. And Jared's memory wasn't just disturbing, it was violent. I saw him staring at something or someone with cold, empty eyes. And I could feel the weight of the action, the finality of it. It was a murder. I started digging. I couldn't just ignore this. The more I listened to their thoughts, the more I uncovered. One student, Lily, had been hiding bruises from her stepfather. Another student, Ryan, had been sneaking around the school at night, looking for something. The pieces didn't make sense, but they were starting to form this terrifying picture. But the more I learned, the more I became convinced that one of them was a killer. I tried to shake it off. I told myself that I was just being paranoid. After all, I didn't really know what was going on in their lives. Maybe I was misinterpreting the things I heard. But the thoughts wouldn't stop. They kept coming, always darker, always more unsettling. I found myself walking into that classroom every day, feeling like I was losing my mind. The students would glance at me, and I'd hear their thoughts, their darkest secrets, their fears, and their sins. One night, I stayed late at school. The building was quiet, just the hum of the fluorescent lights above. I was going through my papers, trying to block out the thoughts that kept whispering in my ears. But then I heard it again. A voice in my head, louder than the others. It was Jared's voice. I didn't mean to. The words were clear. I could hear them, feel them, as if they were coming from within me. I looked up, my heart racing. There, standing in the doorway, was Jared. His face was pale, his eyes hollow. He was staring at me like he knew I knew. Like he knew I had figured it out. I didn't mean to, he repeated, his voice shaking. But I had to. And then just like that, I heard his final thought, the one that made me freeze. I didn't mean to kill her, but she had to be stopped. I don't know how I did it, but I managed to keep my composure long enough to send him out of the room. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. That night, I went through the school's old records, trying to find any connection to the unsolved disappearances I had heard whispers about. That's when I found it. There was a string of missing persons cases, all linked to the school. And Jared's name. His name kept popping up in each one, connected to strange circumstances. Every single disappearance was connected to him in some way, either directly or through people he'd known. I was terrified. The next day, I tried to report what I'd found, but no one believed me. How could they? I was just a teacher, and my claims were insane. They chalked it up to stress, to my growing paranoia. But I knew what I'd seen. I knew what I'd heard. I quit my job soon after. Left that town, never to return. But every time I see a news story about another disappearance, my heart races. What if I was right? What if Jared was just the beginning? So, I guess what I'm saying is this. Sometimes the things we think we know, the things we think we see, are far more dangerous than we realize. And if you ever find yourself in a place where you can hear people's thoughts, be careful, because you might not like what you hear. Sometimes, the most dangerous monsters aren't the ones hiding in the shadows. They're the ones sitting right in front of you, pretending to be just like everyone else. And when you realize who they really are, it might be too late. So the next time you walk into a classroom or a room full of people, remember, you never really know what's going on in someone else's mind. Trust me, It's not something you want to find out the hard way. Sometimes the scariest part isn't what happened. It's knowing it could happen again. Story 10. Sometimes I think about the things that seem so ordinary in the moment, and then you realize, once it's too late, that they were anything but. Let me introduce myself. My name's Claire, and I was 27 when I got the job at that school. It seemed like a dream at first, isolated, rural, tucked away in the rolling hills of the countryside. A quiet school, small town. The kind of place where everyone knows everyone, and the biggest news is a new shop opening or someone's harvest going well. It wasn't the type of job I'd been imagining, more of a stopgap than a career move, but it was a job, and that was all I really needed. At the time, I wasn't exactly looking for adventure. I was just trying to get by, find some peace after a rocky year. Divorce, family drama, moving to a new place. Nothing too wild, but just enough to make you question everything. I figured teaching at a small school, away from the chaos of the city, would be a good reset. It wasn't far from the city, just enough to make you feel disconnected, like there was this big world outside that didn't quite reach here. I found a little apartment above a bakery in town. The smell of fresh bread every morning, the quiet streets. Everything was nice. Too nice, maybe. A little too quiet. The school itself was small, one of those places with faded brick walls and narrow hallways that creaked underfoot. You know the kind. The classrooms were simple, desks lined up in neat rows, chalkboards that had seen better days. It was a strange little place, but that was part of the charm, right? The students, though, that's where things started to get weird. They weren't the kind of kids I was used to. I've taught for a few years in bigger schools, so I've seen all kinds. But these kids, they had a certain presence. Not in a well-behaved way. More like something about them didn't quite sit right. The first time I noticed, it was during an ordinary math lesson. I was explaining a problem, going through the steps, when I realized that one of the students, a boy named Jonah, hadn't blinked in a while. Just stared at me, unblinking, unmoving, like he was studying me. Not in a curious way either. In a way that made my skin crawl. I brushed it off. Probably just some weird kid. But then it happened again the next day with another student, and then another. It was like they were always watching, always waiting. Every class felt like a rehearsal for something, but I couldn't put my finger on what. Every lesson ended with this odd feeling, like the air was too thick, or the walls were closing in, but there was nothing there. Nothing I could see, just the sense that something was off. A week in, I started noticing the strange little things. The whispers among them when they thought I couldn't hear. Conversations that stopped as soon as I walked by. The books they'd leave behind, open to pages that described old rituals or ancient ceremonies. I thought it was just teenage rebellion at first, curiosity about things they shouldn't know about, maybe. But then came the books I couldn't ignore. One morning, I walked into my classroom to find a book on my desk. It was old, worn leather binding, pages yellowed with age. The title was in Latin, something about summoning, but I couldn't read it. I thought about asking the students where it came from, but the words caught in my throat. Jonah was already staring at me, that same unblinking stare. I asked him if he knew where the book had come from. He didn't answer. Instead, he just smiled, a thin, cold smile that didn't reach his eyes. The rest of the class was quieter than usual that day. Even the usual troublemakers, who'd been chattering nonstop the week before, were oddly subdued. Every time I turned to write something on the board, I could feel their eyes on me. And it wasn't just curiosity, it was as if they were studying me, figuring me out. That was when I started digging. You'd think I'd have stopped right there. But no. Curiosity. Stupidity. Whatever it was, I couldn't help it. I had to know. So I started asking around. I spoke to the principal, Mr. Turner, but he didn't seem to think anything was wrong. "They're just kids, Claire," he said, with that annoying, patronizing tone adults sometimes use with younger teachers. "They're into things, books, stories, whatever." So I looked through the library. At first, nothing seemed unusual, until I found a collection of old, handwritten journals hidden in the back corner of the shelf. They were filled with drawings of symbols, rituals, and strange words I couldn't understand. Most of them had faded, but some were still legible. One of the drawings, though, was different. It showed a figure, tall, dark, its form cloaked in shadow, holding a blade dripping with blood. The caption beneath it read, "The Final Sacrifice." At that point, I should have stopped, but I didn't. I couldn't. I started looking more closely at the kids, paying attention to their behavior, their movements. And that's when I realized they weren't just odd. They were preparing for something, and I was the final piece. I started piecing it all together. The books, the strange rituals they'd mutter under their breath, the late-night murmurs in the hallways that would stop the second I walked by. I wasn't imagining it. They were planning something, and I was the one they were planning it for. I stayed up late that night, researching every bit of folklore and myth I could find about ancient rituals, summoning, sacrifices. And that's when I found it. The ritual they were preparing was ancient, tied to a dark entity that demanded a sacrifice, a human one. The final sacrifice was always someone who didn't belong, someone who was chosen without knowing why. I was the one they'd chosen. The next day I went in early. The students were already there, their eyes focused on me as I walked through the door. Jonah smiled again, but this time it wasn't cold, it was knowing. He knew I knew. And that's when the weight of everything hit me. The whispers started again. But this time I could hear the words, tonight. It was the first time I'd heard them say it out loud. And I knew. I knew they were going to do it that night. I didn't wait to see what would happen. I ran, left everything behind. I never went back to that school. The teachers, the students, even the principal, they all disappeared. No one ever found out where they went. The town's been abandoned since then, and every time I pass by, I get a chill down my spine. I don't know what they were preparing for, but I know that sometimes, when you look at people, you can feel like you're being watched, like something is waiting. Sometimes the scariest part isn't what happens, but knowing that you were just one step away from it. So if you ever hear about a place like that, a school in a rural town, just stay away. You don't need to know what they're waiting for. And remember, it could happen anywhere. It could happen to anyone. It could even happen to you. If you made it this far, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that bell for more stories that might just keep you up at night.